I still remember the day like it was yesterday, the day my world shattered, the day I lost my dad. The sky was a dull gray, as if it knew the heaviness of what we were about to endure. Rain threatened to fall, but somehow it held back, almost politely, as if the heavens themselves were observing the funeral. I walked into the small church, the polished wooden floors echoing beneath my shoes, and immediately felt the tension. People murmured in low tones, offering condolences with half-hearted smiles. Some were distant relatives I barely recognized, others old family friends who always looked at me with pity rather than compassion. But it wasn't their expressions that I noticed first, it was my mom. She stood at the front, perfectly composed, dressed in a black tailored suit, her hair immaculately styled. But there was something off about her, something that made my stomach twist. Her eyes didn't linger on my dad's casket. She didn't shed a tear. Instead, she clutched her phone tightly, fingers flicking over the screen in quick, practiced movements. Every so often, she would smile just a little, just enough to make it seem like she was reading something amusing. My dad was gone, yet she seemed distracted. I tried to push the feeling away. Maybe she was just processing her grief in her own way. But as the priest spoke, his voice somber and echoing through the church, I caught snippets of whispered conversations behind me. Did you hear where she's been lately? She's been traveling with her CEO, they say. The words hit me like ice water. My mom. Traveling with her CEO. My dad had been sick, confined to his home for months. And she, my mom, was away, smiling and laughing with someone else. I shook my head, trying to focus on the funeral. The priest's words about life, loss, and legacy blended into a dull hum in my ears. I wanted to scream, to confront her right there in front of everyone. But I couldn't. Not yet. I looked around at the other mourners. Faces etched with sorrow, hands clasped tightly, some dabbing at tears with tissues. And then I noticed her again, my mom. She wasn't crying. She wasn't grieving. She was planning. Something in her expression told me that. The kind of cold, calculating look I had never seen before. The service ended. People approached her, offering condolences, but she barely nodded. She glanced at me, just once, and smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And then, as the casket was lowered into the ground, she walked away. No lingering, no final words to my dad. Just gone. I stayed there for a moment, feeling the rain begin to sprinkle lightly on my shoulders. The wind carried whispers, not just from the mourners, but from some part of my heart that I hadn't listened to before. Suspicion, doubt, betrayal. I didn't know it yet. But that day would mark the beginning of a journey I never asked for, a journey into secrets, lies, and a truth about my family that would change everything. And all of it started with one shocking realization. My mom, the woman who promised to love my dad till the end, had been living a secret life right under all of our noses. Little did I know, what happened that night after the funeral would turn my world upside down entirely. After the funeral, everyone went their separate ways. Family members left in silence, whispers trailing behind them like shadows. I stayed behind a little longer, staring at the freshly covered grave, my heart heavy not just with grief, but with a growing unease. Something didn't sit right. My mom's behavior, her distracted glances, her secret smiles, her sudden departure kept replaying in my mind. By evening, she was gone. She hadn't returned home, and my calls went straight to voicemail. I tried to convince myself she needed space, that maybe she was overwhelmed by Dad's death. But deep down, a small, insistent voice whispered. She's hiding something. It wasn't long before the pieces began to fall into place. A neighbor, someone I barely knew, casually mentioned seeing her mother boarding a private jet just days before the funeral. My stomach twisted. With who? I asked, trying to sound casual. But the woman's eyes widened. The CEO. You know, from that big company she works with. He was seen with her at the airport, she said. I froze. My mom had been traveling with her CEO while Dad was lying sick at home. I needed proof. I couldn't confront her based on gossip alone. That night, I went through her study when I knew she wouldn't be home. Her laptop sat there, unlocked and inviting, as if fate itself had left the evidence on display. There it was: emails, hotel bookings, even a few candid photos that made my stomach churn. My mom laughing in a fancy hotel lobby, a glass of champagne in her hand, while Dad was home, struggling to breathe through pain I had witnessed every day. My hands shook as I scrolled through the messages, sweet nothings, careful words that masked something deeper, something forbidden. I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't even name. Anger, yes. Heartbreak, definitely. But also confusion. How could someone who promised forever betray so easily? How could my mother, treat Dad like he didn't matter in his final moments? And yet, a part of me hesitated. Maybe there was more to the story. Maybe, just maybe, she had reasons I didn't understand. But as I kept digging, the evidence piled up, and the more I saw, the harder it became to ignore. It wasn't just a fling. This CEO had influence, power, and now, it seemed, he had my mother wrapped around his finger. My dad had worked his whole life to protect our family, yet here I was, uncovering a betrayal that could change everything we knew about him, about her, about us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every memory with my dad, every word he had said, every smile he had given. And behind all of it, my mind kept returning to the same haunting thought. My mom had chosen someone else. While my dad was dying, I didn't know then that this was just the beginning. That the truths I was uncovering would lead me down a path I never imagined, a path filled with lies, revenge, and a family secret that would shock me to my core. But one thing was clear: I couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. The days after the funeral were the hardest. Friends and distant relatives offered their condolences, but no one seemed to notice the storm brewing inside me. I couldn't stop thinking about my mom, about her secret trips, her hidden smiles, her connection with that CEO. And yet, as angry as I was, a part of me wondered, was there more I didn't know? It started with small things. Old photographs tucked away in drawers, letters hidden in boxes, even whispered comments from neighbors who clearly knew more than they should. She wasn't always by his side, one elderly neighbor whispered when she thought I wasn't listening. Even when he was ill, she was distracted. I felt my chest tighten. Distracted? That was putting it lightly. But as I dug deeper, I began to see patterns I had ignored for years. My dad had always been a perfectionist, controlling in ways that sometimes left our family suffocating. He monitored our schedules, our friendships, even my mother's. At the time, I thought it was just a quirk, a fatherly need to protect us. But now, it made sense. My mother hadn't just been sneaking around for fun. She had been living in the shadows of a man who demanded control over every corner of her life. I remember finding a letter from my father, addressed to no one in particular. The tone was harsh, demanding, and controlling, but buried underneath, there was pain. He had written about feeling betrayed, not knowing how to trust the people closest to him. Reading it made me shiver. Even now, I couldn't tell if his suspicions were right or wrong, but one thing was certain. The cracks in our family had been there for a long time. And then came the whispers from my relatives. Aunt Margie, who always had her nose in everyone's business, pulled me aside one afternoon. "You know, your Amayam hasn't always been faithful," she said quietly, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "Your father, he suspected something. I don't think he ever knew the full truth." My heart pounded. Suspected? Not knew? That meant my dad had spent months, maybe even years, living under the shadow of a betrayal he might never have confronted. I couldn't imagine the weight of that on him. And the more I learned, the clearer it became. My mother's actions weren't impulsive, they were part of a long story. A web of secrets that no one had been willing to untangle. I started noticing the patterns in my own memories, the sudden business trips she never fully explained, the late nights at work, the whispered phone calls that stopped when I entered the room. At the time, I had ignored them, telling myself my mother was just busy. But now, piecing it together, I realized I had been blind to what was always in front of me. The deeper I dug, the more I realized this wasn't just about a fling or a bad decision. This was about power, control, and survival. My mother had learned to navigate a life under my father's scrutiny, and in doing so, had made choices that would shatter everything the rest of us thought we knew. And yet, even as I began to uncover the truth, a part of me hesitated. I loved my mother, or at least the mother I thought I knew. But the woman I was discovering, she was cunning, calculated, and capable of hurting the people who trusted her most. That night, I sat in my room, surrounded by old photos and letters, feeling both grief and a burning desire for answers. I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't let this go. If I wanted to understand the full story, if I wanted justice for my dad, I had to follow the trail, no matter where it led. Little did I know, the path I was about to take would uncover more than just betrayal. It would reveal secrets that had been buried for years. Secrets that would shake my family to its core and force me to confront a truth I was not prepared to face. I couldn't stop thinking about my mother, the way she smiled that night, the way she left the funeral without a backward glance. I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and a desperate need to understand. I needed answers. And if my mom wasn't going to give them, I would find them myself. It started small. I went back into her study when she was out. Her laptop was always locked, but I had learned the patterns, the subtle ways she left herself vulnerable. And tonight, fortune favored me. Her password was simple, almost careless. Once inside, I was greeted by a digital trail that made my stomach twist. Emails, calendar entries, even hotel bookings, all pointing to one thing: she had been traveling with her CEO during the exact time my dad had been at his weakest. Photos popped up on her desktop: my mother laughing in luxurious lobbies, holding wine glasses, chatting closely with a man I had never thought would mean anything to her. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the messages, each one more intimate, more revealing than the last. But it wasn't just the romantic undertones that shook me. There were contracts, financial documents, and emails from the CEO hinting at investments, meetings, and plans that my dad had never been part of. My mother wasn't just having an affair, she was entwining herself into a world of business and influence that threatened everything my father had built. The more I dug, the angrier I became. But amid the rage, there was clarity. I started piecing together timelines, mapping out every trip, every secret meeting. By the end of the night, I had created a digital map of her life, a life she had kept hidden from the very people who loved her most, and then I found something that made my blood run cold. A series of messages between my mother and the CEO discussing my father's will. It was subtle at first, almost innocuous, but the intent was clear. They were talking about inheritance, about money, about influence. My heart pounded. Could it be that her betrayal wasn't just personal, it was calculated? I sat back, staring at the screen, trying to process it all. My dad had worked his entire life to protect us, to build something lasting, and my mother, my own mother, had been planning behind his back. I felt a wave of grief so strong it made me gasp. But beneath it was something else, a spark of determination. I couldn't confront her yet, not without proof, not without knowing exactly what she had done. So I kept digging. I traced flights, checked hotel receipts, cross-referenced email timestamps. Every small detail added weight to the story I didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore. By the end of that night, I had evidence that could change everything. But I also realized something terrifying. The deeper I went, the more dangerous it became. I was uncovering secrets that someone powerful didn't want revealed, and I was right in the middle of it. And still, despite the fear, despite the heartbreak, I knew I couldn't stop. I needed to understand the full truth. I needed to know why my mother had betrayed my father in the way she had. And most of all, I needed to decide what I was going to do about it. That night, as I closed her laptop and carefully put everything back in its place, I made a silent vow I would get answers. And when the time came, I would make sure the truth was revealed no matter the cost. The days after my secret investigation were unbearable. Every time I saw my mom, my heart twisted, with a mix of anger and disbelief. She moved through the house like nothing had happened, as if my dad's death and the funeral were mere inconveniences in her meticulously curated life. And yet, I had the proof. Every email, every hotel receipt, every message, they were all in my hands now, whispering the truth I couldn't ignore. I decided to start subtly. I needed to see how she would react, how far she would go to hide her secrets. Mom, I said casually one evening, leaning against the doorway as she arranged flowers in the living room, you've been traveling a lot lately. With your CEO, right? Her hands froze mid-motion, the petals trembling slightly under her fingers. She looked at me, eyes wide, masking something I couldn't yet name. Why are you asking that? She said, her voice calm but guarded. I was just curious, I replied lightly, forcing my tone to stay casual. Dad was sick. I just wonder what you were doing while he was home. Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she might explode with anger. But instead, she smiled carefully, calculatingly, like a woman used to playing every angle. I had to take care of business, she said softly. Your father wouldn't have understood. He never did. I studied her, noting the way she avoided my eyes, the subtle tension in her shoulders. She was hiding something, and I could see it in the smallest gestures. But there was more than that. I realized that this CEO wasn't just a casual fling. He had power, influence, and my mother was entwined in it. Somehow, he had become a part of our family's affairs, and I wasn't sure if I could stop him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying her words in my mind, analyzing every inflection, every pause. She was defensive, yes, but there was fear there too. Fear of exposure. Fear that someone would uncover the truth. And I realized something chilling. If I pushed the right buttons, I could unravel everything she had carefully built. Over the next few days, I tested her again, dropping hints and watching her reactions. Each time, she became more guarded, more meticulous, more careful. And each time, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and dread. I was getting closer, but I also knew that pushing too hard could backfire. Then came the first revelation that shook me to my core. While casually flipping through some papers on her desk, supposedly business documents, I noticed references to our family's finances, contracts, and inheritance discussions. The CEO's name appeared multiple times, alongside my mother's. They weren't just planning secret meetings, they were planning influence over the family business. I swallowed hard. My mom's betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. She was playing a long game, one that threatened everything my father had built. And I realized, with a mix of fear and determination, that if I wanted to reclaim the truth, I would have to play my own game. That night, I looked at her from across the room, her silhouette framed by the warm glow of the lamp. She smiled again, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. But I knew the truth now. And when the time came, she wouldn't see what hit her. The first confrontation was only the beginning. I had the proof. I had the knowledge. And now, I had the resolve. The discovery came unexpectedly, like a knife hidden in plain sight. I was going through some old files in my dad's study, looking for any clues that might explain what my mother had been planning. My fingers brushed against a leather-bound folder, hidden behind rows of business ledgers. It wasn't labeled. Curiosity and something deeper, a sense of inevitability, compelled me to open it. Inside were documents I never expected to see, contracts, letters, and finally, the will. Not just any will, but a version my father had secretly rewritten months before his death. I sank into the chair, my hands trembling as I read the words. The terms were clear. My mother would not inherit everything. Portions of the estate, investments, and family assets were being rerouted partly to me, partly to charities my father had supported, partly to distant relatives. My father had planned for her betrayal, for her secret ambitions. And somehow, he had known. I felt a strange mix of relief and horror. Relief that my father had thought ahead, that he had tried to protect me and the family. Horror because it meant my mother had been operating under a false sense of security all this time, thinking she would inherit it all. That night, I watched her carefully, pretending to be distracted while I pieced together the timeline of her betrayals. Emails, hotel stays, secret calls, it all painted a picture of a woman who thought she was untouchable. But now, the power balance had shifted. The revelation of the will gave me leverage I hadn't had before. And then it hit me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice. About exposing the truth of who she really was, not just for me, but for my father's memory, for our family legacy. My anger hardened into resolve. Every smile she had given the CEO, every whispered lie, every betrayal, it was all coming to light. But I had to be careful. She was sharp, cunning, and used to controlling people. One wrong move, and everything could backfire. I needed a plan. I needed to understand every facet of her scheme, every alliance she had forged. Especially with that CEO. The thought of confronting her directly crossed my mind, but I knew that before I did, I had to gather more evidence, more leverage. The will had given me a tool, but it was just the beginning. I needed to see how deep the deception went and prepare for the moment when I would finally reveal it. That night, I felt something I hadn't felt since my dad died. A sense of purpose. The grief was still there, gnawing at my heart, but it was joined by determination. I would not let my father's memory be tarnished by betrayal. I would not allow my mother's secret life to overshadow the truth. And as I stared at the stack of documents, the full weight of what I had discovered began to sink in. The path ahead would be dangerous, emotional, and messy. But for the first time since the funeral, I felt in control. I knew the truth. I had the proof. And I was ready to take the next step. This twist, this revelation of my father's foresight, would change everything. My mother had underestimated me. She didn't know what I had found. She didn't know I was ready, and soon she would pay the price. The days following my discovery of the will were a whirlwind of emotion. I felt grief, anger, and betrayal in waves, but beneath it all, a calm determination began to settle. My mother had underestimated me. She thought I was naive, vulnerable, grieving. But she had no idea how much I had learned, or how far I was willing to go. I knew I couldn't act recklessly. Revenge required patience, strategy, and precision. I needed to expose the truth without leaving room for denials, manipulations, or reversals. I needed evidence, timing, and control. The first step was the CEO. I knew he wasn't just a passive partner in her betrayals. He had influence, power, and stakes in our family affairs. I began tracking his movements, analyzing emails, and even setting up subtle social media surveillance. It wasn't about spying, it was about collecting undeniable proof of their collusion. Next, I reached out to distant relatives and old family friends, quietly planting seeds of information. I shared certain truths, not everything, just enough to create curiosity, suspicion, and tension. I wanted them alert, ready, and aware that the facade my mother maintained was cracking. I also started to document everything meticulously. Every hotel booking, every private message, every suspicious transaction. I compiled it all into a file that could withstand scrutiny. I imagined her face when the evidence would finally be undeniable. The thought made my chest tighten, but not with anger alone. It was anticipation. A careful, controlled fire burning inside me. I began testing small confrontations, dropping hints, watching her reactions. Every time she flinched just slightly, a shadow crossing her perfect composure. She was smart, but she wasn't infallible. And I had discovered her weak spots. Then came the first, small victories. Subtle changes in her behavior, the CEO becoming cautious, whispers among relatives that hadn't existed before. It was satisfying to see the first signs of disruption, proof that my plan was working. But I knew this was just the beginning. The real exposure, the moment that would reveal the full extent of their betrayal, needed to be timed perfectly. At night, I would sit in my room, reviewing my notes, replaying conversations, analyzing every interaction. I thought about my father, about what he would have wanted. I thought about justice, dignity, and the need to reclaim what had been threatened. Revenge wasn't about cruelty, it was about balance, truth, and closure. And as I plotted each step carefully, a bold thought entered my mind. I wouldn't just expose them. I would make them face the consequences of their actions, not behind closed doors. Not with whispered apologies, but openly, in front of the family. In front of everyone who had been hurt. I knew it would be messy, painful, and dramatic, but that was the point. My mother had toyed with people's emotions for too long. The CEO had manipulated and influenced our family affairs. It was time the tables turned. That night, I finally allowed myself a small, victorious smile. The plan was in motion. The first moves had been made. And soon, everything they thought was hidden would be brought into the light. The night that would change everything was approaching, and when it arrived, no one would be able to ignore the truth. I picked the date like a chess player choosing the moment to sacrifice a queen. It wasn't random. It was our family's annual charity gala, a night when our house would be full of familiar faces, when the town's movers and shakers would be under one roof, and when everyone who mattered would be watching. My mother loved these events. The applause, the polite conversations, the way she could glide through a room and make people think she was in control. It was the perfect stage. The house was dressed in its finest. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across the ballroom, and the smell of roses and expensive perfume folded into the hum of polite laughter. Photographers circled like moths, catching smiles and stiff handshakes. I watched it all from the edge of the room, a glass of water I never drank cooling in my hand. The file of evidence tucked beneath my arm like a talisman. My mother arrived radiant, practiced grace. Flawless makeup, a dress that whispered money. The CEO came with her, of course, hands folded in the way of a man who knew how to filter charm through power. He smiled at the crowd, delivering the right lines, placing himself at the center of every conversation, like a sun people would orbit. They didn't know the trap was set. I had invited a handful of people I trusted, cousins who had always been honest, Aunt Margie, who loved gossip so much she became useful, and a lawyer friend of my father's who had once sat in his study and listened to my father's quiet frustrations. I had also sent anonymous copies of select evidence to 2 local journalists who had a nose for corruption. I wanted this to hit wider than our parlor walls. I needed witnesses, then and there, people who could not be swayed by a well-placed apology later. The evening flowed like a river. Speeches, laughter, the clink of glasses. My mother took the stage to talk about philanthropy and legacy, words my father had once used to bind our family into respectability. She spoke of the importance of preserving what my father built. I watched her mouth the lines and felt bile rise in my throat. When she finished, applause rolled through the room. The CEO stood beside her, placing a hand lightly on her back as if to claim credit. He smiled at me with a confidence I recognized as arrogance. That smile was going to be the last thing he wore before it cracked. I took a breath and stepped up to the microphone. For a second, the music hummed and I thought I'd be drowned out by the noise of the night, but the room hushed. People turned. Eyes found me. My knees were steady. Everything I had done, every sleepless night and quiet gathering of proof, led here. Thank you, I said, my voice low but clear. My family has always stood for charity and truth. Tonight I want to speak about both. I watched my mother's smile crumble ever so slightly, the way a mask loosens at the seam. The CEO's hand tightened around his glass. I'd like to tell you a story about truth, I continued. About how grief can hide the sharpest betrayals. I played the first clip, a short, unambiguous audio of the CEO arranging an off-the-book meeting with my mother, referring to accounts that needed restructuring. People shifted. The whisper started and spread like spilled ink. I watched my mother's face as the second clip played, a video of them laughing together in a hotel suite, champagne flutes in hand, the CEO saying, "Don't worry, once he's gone, everything will be simpler." The room inhaled. Someone in the back made an involuntary noise. A fork clattered. My mother's eyes searched mine, wide and betrayed, but there was no salvage. She mouthed something like no, and then like how, and then smoothed the mask she always wore. But it was too late. The evidence continued. Receipts, messages, photographed bank transfers blurred enough to hide account numbers but clear enough to reveal intent. My father's old lawyer, the one I'd quietly informed, stepped forward. These documents indicate manipulation of funds and undue influence on the late Mr. Harlem's estate, he said, using my father's name like a blessing, like a shield. They also suggest collusion with company assets that should not have been leveraged against the family. A murmur turned into a slow, heavy silence. Faces drained. Some people looked at my mother with pity, others with the sharp edge of judgment. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. She wasn't the only one speechless. The CEO's polite composure had been replaced by an animal's first awareness of a trap. He tried to recover, to flip the narrative. "This is a misunderstanding," he began. "We were discussing, you were plotting," I interrupted, and my voice didn't shake. "You were plotting to take advantage of my father while he was ill. Two appropriate parts of his life and legacy." He laughed, a high, brittle sound. "You have no idea what you're playing at, child." "Maybe," I said. "But I have proof." I let that sentence hang. "And so do they." I gestured to the small group I'd assembled, to the lawyer, to the two journalists whose cameras were now discreetly aimed at the stage. That's when the CEO's insistence veered straight into threats. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "You think money and influence can't fight back." He underestimated one thing entirely. He was not dealing with a scared girl. He was up against someone who'd learned how to hold a secret like a loaded gun. The journalist moved closer, asking questions. Phones recorded. The crowd edged in, hungry for scandal. My mother's face had gone very pale. Then my cousin, the one who had been closest to our father in his last months, stepped up and spoke blunt truth into the microphone. "Your wife was here," he said, voice steady. "But she was not here to care for him. She'd be gone for days, and when she returned, she would bring more than perfume. She brought plans. We watched. We suspected. But we never expected." His voice broke, then steadied. "We never expected such coldness." My mother stumbled out something like an apology, but there was no tear in sight, no real remorse. Her lips moved as if reciting a script practiced in front of a mirror. People started asking questions out loud now. The murmurs weren't whispers anymore, they were a chorus. The CEO decided to go scorched earth. He tried to brand the evidence as fabrications, photographs doctored, messages taken out of context. The journalists asked for verifications, and my file was on the laptop I'd had one of the cousins bring. The documents were scanned, time-stamped, corroborated. The lawyer I'd contacted provided legal insight, undue influence, manipulation of corporate accounts, and potential criminal charges if the facts held up. My mother finally crumpled, not dramatically, but quietly. The dam didn't break with a scream. It cracked and let out a slow trickle of panic. I expected the instant denial, the gaslighting. What I did not expect was the way she turned to the CEO and whispered something that sounded like anger, not hurt. "You promised me security," she hissed, "and now you want to throw me away." He looked at her, a flicker of regret or strategic repositioning, I couldn't tell which. Then the room, which had been soaked in revelation, turned and watched as the person many had admired for her poise showed the world her fracture. The CEO's allies tried to rally, people who stood to gain from his success. A few influential guests took his side temporarily, worried about their own reputations, their own investments. It was ugly and immediate, the way people scramble when the scaffolding of civility is pulled away. But then something remarkable happened. People began to tell their own stories. A vendor spoke up, then a board member of a charity we supported. Little truths surfaced: paid visits that weren't for hospice checks, late-night meetings at hotels under the guise of strategy. The gallery of proof swelled into an undeniable portrait. At some point in the chaos, my mother looked at me. Her eyes were bright not with tears but with panic and a kind of raw, surviving ferocity. She lunged toward me across the stage, hands out for sympathy, and I felt, for a flicker, the old urge to hug her, to beg for a different life. But the hug would be a lie. The apology would be a performance. This was no longer about pity. This was about truth. "You think you can ruin me in front of everyone?" she whispered when she reached me, close enough that only I could hear. Her voice trembled. "You will regret this." "No," I said softly, and the decision had the weight of my father's last steadying hand. "I won't regret telling the truth." Security moved in as the event devolved into argument and accusation. The journalists recorded the rest. The photos captured the strained lines on my mother's face, the glimpses of the CEO's fury. When the night finally wound down, people dispersed, some with anger, some with sorrow, some with detached curiosity. But one thing was clear: the house had been split open. Whatever veneer my mother had built was shattered. Afterwards, as quiet settled, like a shroud, I sat alone on the back steps, the night air cool and steady. I thought of my father, of his silence in the months before he died, of the will hidden in his desk, of the man he was and the sacrifices he must have considered. I thought of my mother, of what she had done and what she had become. I didn't celebrate. I felt hollow and exhausted. Truth had been spoken, yes, but it had come wrapped in grief. The price of the revelation was not simply the CEO's fall from grace. It was also the fracture in my family, the way people I loved watched each other and recalculated loyalty. Some would never forgive me. Some would never forgive her. That night changed everything. The CEO's empire began to tremble in public view. My mother's control slipped out of her fingers. But the victory felt less like triumph and more like a wound finally opened, painful, necessary, and impossible to ignore. As I went to bed in the dark of my old room, I realized the path ahead would be longer than I thought. Exposure was only the first step. There would be legal battles, gossip that might never die, and a reckoning that could cost me dearly. But for the first time since the funeral, I felt something else, a sense of justice that my father deserved, a knowledge that the truth had come out, and an iron resolve that I would see this through. The night had changed everything, and it had changed me. The morning after the gala, our house felt like a battlefield that no one had yet cleaned. Empty champagne glasses lined the counters, chairs were scattered across the living room, and the air was heavy with unsaid words. But the most palpable weight came from the silence between family members. My mother stayed in her room, the door closed, probably rehearsing her excuses or deciding how to salvage what little remained of her dignity. The CEO had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of bewildered associates and a few angry messages that never reached me. In his absence, the family had to face reality. The truth had been exposed, and nothing could cover it up. Relatives called, some to offer support, others to gossip. Friends whispered behind doors. The small town, which had always admired my mother's composure and charm, now saw cracks. Some were subtle, others brutal. But for the first time, the family wasn't operating under her control. The mask was gone, and the true picture was undeniable. I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Relief because justice had been served, and exhaustion because the victory wasn't clean. Exposure brought consequences, yes, but it also brought scrutiny. The aftermath of revealing someone's deepest betrayal is never neat. It leaves traces, scars, and awkward, lingering pain. I watched my mother in those days, attempting to regain composure, offering the occasional defensive smile to relatives, but it was hollow. People had started asking questions in ways she couldn't dodge. Subtle confrontations, casual remarks that revealed awareness of her deception. They chipped away at her authority, piece by piece. And yet, I realized something important. Revenge alone didn't heal me. It didn't erase the grief I felt for my father. It didn't undo the loneliness that had set in during the months of secret betrayal. What it did was give me clarity, power, and control over a situation I had once felt powerless in. I began to rebuild my life slowly. Conversations with relatives became more open and honest. The family business, once a place of tension and manipulation, began to return to the principles my father had intended. People started to support me in ways they hadn't before. Seeing that I had not only uncovered the truth but handled it with a level of poise and courage that demanded respect. My mother remained in her isolation, a figure of authority undone. She tried to reach out occasionally, offering explanations, apologies, or gestures meant to smooth over what had happened. But I had learned something crucial. Some people's apologies are just words, and some betrayals are permanent. She had made her choices. I had made mine. I also realized that revenge wasn't about cruelty. It wasn't about humiliation or punishment. It was about balance, truth, and reclaiming what was stolen. I had exposed her betrayal, yes, but I had also reclaimed my family's legacy and my father's memory. And in doing so, I had reclaimed myself. Looking back, I understood why my father had been cautious, why he had hidden the will, why he had tried to protect the family even as betrayal threatened it. He had understood the fragility of trust and the resilience needed to protect what mattered most. I now carried that same understanding. The aftermath was messy, emotional, and painful, but it was also a beginning. A beginning where I could finally navigate my life on my own terms, free from deception, manipulation, and lies. And in that clarity, I found a strength I hadn't realized I possessed. By the end of that week, the family was still fractured, but the pieces were settling into a new arrangement. I was no longer just a grieving daughter. I was a guardian of truth, a witness to betrayal, and a force to be reckoned with. And though the scars remained, so did the knowledge that justice had been done, and the story had finally been told. It took weeks for the dust to settle, but eventually the truth became a part of our daily lives. The gala, which had seemed like chaos in the moment, now felt like a turning point, a clear line between the life we had been living and the life we were finally reclaiming. I found myself walking past my father's study, lingering over the desk where he had carefully hidden the will. I imagined him watching, knowing that even in death, he had protected us from betrayal. The thought filled me with bittersweet comfort. He wasn't here to witness the confrontation, but I felt his presence guiding me, steadying me, giving me permission to reclaim the family he had built. My mother remained in her isolated world, stripped of the power she had tried to wield. Her gestures, once commanding and confident, were now cautious, hollow, and measured. She had been exposed not just to the family, but to herself. Some days, I felt a twinge of pity, remembering the mother I once loved. But grief for her betrayal had long since transformed into acceptance. She had made her choices. I had made mine. The CEO, who had seemed untouchable, disappeared from our lives entirely. His influence dissolved under scrutiny, and the whispers of his schemes faded into history. I realized that power without integrity is fragile, and the stronger truth is always the one that survives. As for me, I began to rebuild. Not just the family legacy, Not just the trust that had been broken, but my own sense of self. I learned that strength doesn't come from avoiding pain. It comes from facing it. It comes from seeking truth, even when it's uncomfortable. It comes from standing firm in the face of betrayal and refusing to let it define you. The experience had changed me. I was no longer just a grieving daughter navigating the shadows of my parents' lives. I was someone who had uncovered lies, faced uncomfortable truths, and taken control of my own destiny. I had learned that revenge, when guided by justice and clarity, can be transformative rather than destructive. It can be a path toward empowerment, understanding, and self-respect. Most importantly, I realized that family isn't defined by appearances, secrets, or betrayal. It's defined by truth, courage, and the choices we make when faced with darkness. My father's memory, once overshadowed by grief and deceit, now stood as a testament to resilience, integrity, and love. Sitting in the quiet of my room, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The storm had passed, the truths had been revealed, and a new chapter had begun. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be perfect. There would always be echoes of betrayal, moments of tension, and reminders of what had happened, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I looked at the horizon outside my window, the night sky dotted with stars, and whispered a silent promise to myself: no more lies, no more secrets, no more shadows. From now on, I would live with clarity, strength, and the knowledge that I had faced the darkest parts of my family and emerged stronger, wiser, and unbroken, and that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. Thanks for watching. Hoped you liked it. If you watched till the end, please comment revenge so that we could understand you were with us till the end. As well as, please let us know, where are you watching from? What do you want to hear from us in next video? If you have any incident in your life, please let us know. We would love to share your story.